Oxford University Press and the Centre for Education and Youth are delighted to welcome you all to the launch of the Oxford Language Report 2020, Bridging the Word Gap at Transition. I'm Will Millard, Head of Engagement at the Centre for Education and Youth, or CfEY for short, and I'm going to be chairing today's event. I know everyone listening will be eager to hear about the report, what it's found and why it matters, and don't worry, we'll be coming to that very, very shortly. But first, some housekeeping. In terms of the structure of today's event, we're going to hear from OUP and CfEY about why we've done this work, why it matters, and what it reveals about vocabulary at the transition between primary and secondary schooling. We're then going to hear responses from Emma Hardy MP and our panellists, who are Dr. Jessie Ricketts, Reader, Department of Psychology at Royal Holloway, University of London, Claire Jones, Deputy Head Teacher at Marine Academy, Geoff Barton, the General Secretary at the Association of School and College Leaders.
Hello.
And Helen Prince, English Advisor and CEO of ChatterStars.
Morning.
Morning. We're thrilled that you can all join us and look forward to hearing your thoughts. We'll then have a Q&A with the panel. If you have a question you'd like to pose to the panel, please submit it through the chat function in Zoom. We also want this to be as interactive as possible, so please share thoughts, observations and comments in the chat box too. You can tweet about the event using the hashtag WordGap, which is all one word, and I'm going to post now into the chat the various Twitter handles of our panellists and the organisations involved. I have a feeling. There we go. Finally, just a word on the Centre for Education and Youth. We're a think and action tank, and we exist to help all children and young people make a fulfilling transition into adulthood. It's my pleasure now to hand over to Jane Harley, Policy and Partnership Director at OUP's Oxford Education, who is going to tell us why OUP and CfEY have done this work and why it matters. Over to you, Jane.
Thanks, Will. We're delighted to be publishing this report today in association with the Centre for Education and Youth. Oxford University Press has a deeply rooted commitment to young people's language development. It sits at the heart of education. And we seek to drive positive change in educational outcomes through our publishing. And nowhere can be more important than the area of language and literacy. Through our Oxford Children's Corpus, we monitor closely the language pupils read and write. And for the last 10 years in the BBC 500 Words competition, we've celebrated the creativity in how children use vocabulary, create new words and express themselves. And we've looked at how language use changes and develops. But also as part of our ongoing market research, we're committed to engaging with schools to better understand the language needs of pupils of all abilities and the challenges facing teachers. In 2017, following increasing feedback from teachers that the word gap, where children's vocabulary levels were below age expectations, was impacting on all aspects of school life, we decided to embark on a major piece of research to look at exactly what that impact was across primary and secondary schools. The findings were published in 2018 in our first Oxford Language Report, Why Closing the Word Gap Matters, and they were very disturbing. Over half the teachers surveyed reported that up to 40% of their pupils lacked the vocabulary to access their learning. Not only that, but it was felt the problem was getting worse in more than 60% of primary and secondary schools. What also emerged from these findings was the impact this was having on young people. Language underpins progress. It impacts on attainment, it affects self-esteem and behaviour, and plays a huge role in a child's future life chances. It's clearly an area to be addressed. Since that time, awareness has been greatly raised and there are policy initiatives very much targeting the early years and language development with Nuffield's Early Language Intervention, a high-impact intervention published by Oxford University Press, now a key strand of the Education Endowment Foundation's National Tutoring Programme. However, while early years is hugely important and clearly it's critical to get that right, we've also been concerned to keep monitoring vocabulary development across schools. In the course of a 3-year programme of research, we've gathered over 3,500 survey responses from teachers to gain a better understanding of the impact and trends of the word gap and its ongoing impact on young people. While our research builds on our earlier language report, we decided this time with the Centre for Education and Youth to shine a light on an area that emerged as really significant: transition, that pivotal time when pupils move from primary into secondary school. We wanted to ask 2 important questions. What role does vocabulary play in pupils making a successful transition between primary and secondary school? And how can schools support pupils' vocabulary development during this transition? We learned that in schools, roughly 43% of pupils had a word gap at transition. As they progressed from primary into secondary, Year 7 pupils were exposed to a huge amount of new language, up to 3 or 4 times as many words a day, partly as a result of the increase in academic vocabulary. As with our last report, the word gap was also felt to impact on academic performance, test results, behaviour, self-esteem, and future opportunities. We were due to publish this report and its findings in the spring of 2020, having sought input from schools and language experts as to what policies, strategies, and activities could be employed to counteract the word gap's damaging effects. And then the pandemic struck. Schools closed, and we moved into a whole new world of remote learning. A new vocabulary emerged: lockdown, hybrid or blended learning, COVID-19. It was clearly not enough for us to launch a report in spring without trying to take into account what this might mean for children's vocabulary development. So we embarked on further research with the Centre for Education and Youth in May to gauge how teachers felt the pandemic was impacting on the word gap. And we're enormously grateful to those teachers who engaged in that process at what was such a difficult and uncertain time. I think the fact that they did speaks volumes about how much this issue resonates with them and how much they need our support. There's been much in the press about the impact of the pandemic on disadvantaged children and the widening of the gap, and our research findings corroborated this, with 92% of respondents stating they felt the summer lockdown would have contributed to widening the vocabulary gap. The report we're launching today, Bridging the Word Gap at Transition, I have in front of me, has, we believe, stark findings, which Loic will talk about. And the aim of today is very much to start the debate and focus on what more can be done to build a shared understanding and more coherence between vocabulary development across primary and secondary schools. At Oxford University Press, we believe there's a real opportunity to address this issue and make a difference to young people's lives. Our report draws on great practice that is already going on through the case studies and academic research that are in the report. But vocabulary underpins all subjects, and we believe that in the current climate, all children deserve access to the language they need to be successful, both academically but in their everyday lives. And I really look forward to hearing the views of our panel and to taking this dialogue forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Jane. Loic, over to you next for an overview of the key findings and the recommendations in the report.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, as writing this report, I couldn't help reflecting back on my own time in the classroom and what I did to support my pupils' vocabulary back then. But thinking about it, I think I would have been found to be pretty much requiring improvement when I did so, because I think it was pretty much limited to the odd keyword test and maybe awarding some merit marks when pupils used some nice technical vocabulary in their writing. So typically focusing on that kind of tier 3 vocabulary, so the technical, the subject specific language. But if I'm even more honest, I think I didn't even recognize the difference between those tiers of language, tier 1, 2 and 3 vocabulary that we talk about in this report. So having admitted how little I knew back then, what do I know now, having spent this time working on this report? Well, firstly, as Jane said, this issue of primary to secondary school transition is really key, with 9 out of 10 teachers agreeing that transition highlights vocabulary issues. And what's interesting about that is that it's not just secondary school teachers pointing out that. Primary teachers are well aware of it too. But despite that being clearly such a big issue, we found that whilst 8 out of 10 primary school teachers say that vocabulary development is a high strategic priority in their school, this drops to only 5 in 10 at secondary level. Despite the fact that this solid body of research shows that transition is not the time for vocabulary to drop down the priority list. And as Jane pointed out, we cite research by Professor Alice Danon in this report that shows that in the average day at secondary school, pupils are exposed to 3 or 4 times more language than they are at primary school. And we need to prepare pupils for this. So that's where this report comes in. In order to answer those questions, how can we support pupils better? We looked at what's causing the issue. Well, what is it then? Firstly, the focus of vocabulary changes as pupils progress through their education, with a clear trend from the early years to primary to secondary and then on to post-16, where the focus moves from social well-being, social communication and emotional well-being towards academic achievement across the phases, which is understandable, but places different demands on pupils. And yet, 2/3 of teachers feel that they've got insufficient time to focus on vocabulary development. And at secondary school, that figure's even higher, around 3/4. And teachers don't have enough support for this, and this is something that we're calling for more of in this report, much better support, because only 1/4 of teachers are accessing expert CPD when it comes to vocab. Yet, half of those who do say that they find it really helpful. And where secondary schools have got a whole school programme of vocabulary to develop their pupils' vocabulary, we find that unfortunately the quality is still too low, with only 1 in 20 describing it as very effective. But here's where I think this report provides some hope. So I believe it's really going to make a contribution to the body of professional knowledge that teachers have at their fingertips, ensuring that they understand vocabulary more deeply, how it works and how to support it. It also points the way to schools like Broken Cross Primary, Birchwood Community High, Newmarston Primary School and Greenshaw High School, who are taking action. They're developing coherent, consistent, cross-school programmes to support vocabulary. They're working with colleagues across phases and departments, and they're supporting parents, most importantly, to embrace the ways that they can help their children to develop the language they need to flourish. Thirdly, it emphasises the richness of different forms of language and vocabulary that pupils can acquire in their community, with their parents and with their peers. And we make it clear in this report that different registers and different lexicons have got value, and that we need to help pupils and support them to code switch so that they can navigate between different language fluently. Unfortunately, we obviously find ourselves at a particularly difficult time, with so many teachers feeling that school closures are exacerbating difficulties with vocabulary. But the truth is this, that this isn't actually a new issue, and that these findings should only force us to grasp the nettle and take action to give pupils the language they need to succeed. Which is why I'm really pleased to have partnered with OUP on this, who have a track record of thought leadership and supporting schools in this area, on a report that I think would genuinely have helped me to go well beyond keyword tests in the classroom, and which will help schools across the country to bridge the word gap.
Thank you, Loic. Really helpful overview there of the research and its key findings. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Emma Hardy MP now to offer a short response to the report. And just very quickly before I do, I want to note Emma's commitment actually not just to education, but specifically to language, of course, through her support of this report on vocabulary, but also through her work on the oracy APPG. So thank you for that ongoing commitment, Emma. It's no small feat amidst everything else that you're thinking about at the minute. And yeah, delighted that you can join us this morning and share your thoughts.
Morning, everyone. You'll have to excuse me for the fact I'm clearly sitting in a bedroom talking to you all, and for the sound of drilling behind me, where I subtly disappeared to try and close the door and muffle the sound. But it's the joy of working from home. So I just arrived back from London very late last night, so apologies for all of that. Thank you for mentioning, Will, because I'm speaking today as chair of the Oracy All-Party Parliamentary Group, because it is something I believe very passionately in. Having been an infant teacher for over 10 years, I clearly understand the link between behaviour and communication, and how children who particularly younger children, can get very frustrated when they're unable to express themselves in the way that they would like to. And also, I'm pleased we're talking about the word gap today, but sorry, the banging. But in more general, I think it's important to widen the conversation around communication and see how, especially in today's day and age, where differences of opinion seem to be exasperated by social media and a Twitter word limit, how important it is to have an open dialogue, and how to, as I always said as a teacher, and still say now as a member of Parliament, how to disagree without being disagreeable, which I think is the aim for everybody. So this is crucially important, and having looked at some of the, sorry if you can hear the sound of the drilling, I think a specific focus on developing vocabulary is really important, because it sometimes has felt like the government have got things the wrong way round. They focused very early on the art of writing without really, I think, recognising, especially in the early years, how crucially important it is to get children conversing and having those conversations. And as a teacher, we used to go through the little mantra of, think it, say it, write it, read it. You have to be able to think in sentences. You have to be able to speak in sentences before you can even start to begin to try and write it. And it feels sometimes the drive from the curriculum was to jump straight to the writing part without recognising all the cognitive development that goes on behind. So I think a specific focus on vocabulary is so crucially important. And particularly when you're talking about in relation to COVID-19, because one of the points Professor Robin Alexander and I were discussing was how the impact of COVID is going to change the way teachers actually teach in the classroom, and whether we're actually going to see a reduction in classroom talk because of COVID. Because if you're moving pupils to all be sitting sort of in rows facing the front, it's not a natural environment to spark conversations between pupils and to look at specifically developing vocabulary, because of the physical way classrooms are having to be laid out. So we're going to be looking at that in the APPG, and I have huge sympathy with you having to delay your report, because our Oracy APPG report has been delayed so far by a general election and a pandemic, so goodness knows what's coming next. But I really am hoping that we do get it out really soon, or at least be able to publish part of it, because things are changing at such an incredible rate. And I think you're quite right to point out the impact this has had on pupils who have the most disadvantage. Already 18 months, and we can only see it starting to get even greater. So this report really builds on some of the work and the evidence that we've had in from the APPG, which is around the importance of language and communication, and more specifically, the need for it to be explicitly taught, because that's the thing that seems to be missing. I think there's been for too long this belief that sort of language can just develop, and it does for many children, and it is successful for some. But I think as a whole, we need to look at how do we explicitly teach oracy, how do we explicitly teach language development and vocabulary, and give teachers, of course, the space and time to do it. Because the last thing I want to be saying to any teachers right now when they're absolutely exhausted looking at facing half term is, here's a lot more work for you. So this obviously has to be done with support and and resources for teachers and schools out there. But I think most teachers, especially I would obviously argue early years teachers, do really understand the crucial importance of oracy, of communication, of language development. But I think they just need to be given the space to be allowed to do it. And I think with the overcrowding of the curriculum, that can be the biggest challenge, that teachers know what's right and they know what they should be doing, but they're also often limited by what they are told they have to do. So I hope this is the beginning of a conversation, and it really feeds in so nicely with the work that we've done on the Oracy APPG, which I hope you'll contribute to, Loic and Will. And lovely to be on a panel with so many people I admire. So I look forward to hearing the rest of it. And I will go on mute now, so you won't hear the sound of drill.
Thanks so much, Emma. And so admirable oracy skills, offering us your reflections with all the drilling in the background. So thank you for that. And also picking up on the links between vocabulary and oracy, which I'm sure is something our panel will come back to. So with that, I'm now going to invite each of our panelists to speak for 5 minutes, or up to 5 minutes, I should say, about their thoughts on the report, why vocabulary matters at transition, and how they think schools can and should respond to the report's findings. I'm delighted, first of all, to invite Dr. Jessie Ricketts, who, as I said in my introduction, is Reader at the Department of Psychology, Royal Holloway, University of London. So Jessie, over to you.
Thank you very much. So we've already had drilling. I've already been kicked out of this webinar, so hopefully that won't happen again. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. I'm really, really excited about this report. My research at Royal Holloway centres around the relationship between spoken language and reading and literacy. I'm particularly passionate about vocabulary because I see it very much as the kind of linchpin in the centre of all language. We need to know words before we can do anything else. As Emma Hardy MP said really nicely, of course, vocabulary is important, everything else is important as well. But also this point of vocabulary and spoken language as being the foundation for literacy. We really do need to get that foundation in place before we start moving forward with literacy, and that is really important. And of course, once children start learning to read, that then feeds back into their spoken language. So it becomes this lovely kind of synergistic kind of relationship. So I'm really excited about this report. I think there are a number of really important findings and really important points in it. I've just chosen 3 to talk about today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about supporting vocabulary and why we need to do maybe a bit more of that, distinguishing between different kinds of vocabulary and the notion of the vocabulary gap. So one of the really key findings from the report, in my view, is that vocabulary is seen as a strategic priority. And that absolutely resonates with all of my interactions with teachers throughout my career. But what's more important, I think, is that this seems to be more the case for primary versus secondary teachers. And again, that resonates with my interactions with teachers. So I think the reason why that is important is because one of the things that my research shows is that vocabulary knowledge is incredibly variable amongst pupils. So it ranges from pupils who know very little about words, actually, especially at the beginning of school, right up to adult levels of vocabulary, even by mid-primary school. So enormous variation. And actually that variation doesn't change that much from upper primary to upper secondary. So what that shows really is that there are still children in Key Stage 3, this is what my research focused on, who have fairly minimal vocabulary knowledge actually in real terms. They look quite like children aged between kind of 6 and 9, the average that you would expect in that kind of age range. And clearly that's not going to be sufficient to support access to the secondary curriculum. So that is kind of concerning, and it does suggest that we need to make sure that we are supporting those children. So we don't need to just be concerned about vocabulary in primary, we also need to be concerned about vocabulary in secondary, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here on that. The second thing that's really important, as Loic mentioned about this report, is it distinguishes between different kinds of vocabulary. And I think that gives us tells us really interesting things about what we need to target in instruction in schools. So we've got tier 1 vocabulary, everyday vocabulary, that early years teachers tend to be quite focused on as children transition into school. And then we have tier 3 subject specific kind of technical vocabulary in secondary school. That seems to be a particular focus in upper primary and secondary school. But we also have this tier 2 vocabulary, which is the kind of glue, I guess, that pulls all of the other words together. So these are words that operate across contexts and also across curriculum subjects like analyze and so on. And the report does suggest that maybe we need to be focusing a bit more on that. In my own research, I tend to focus on measuring tier 1 and tier 2 vocabulary. And that is where we see that actually knowledge is kind of below what we would like for many children, even in early secondary school. So we still need to be focusing on supporting everyday vocabulary and these kind of tier 2 words like analyze well into secondary school and perhaps even beyond, amongst my own undergraduate students as well. So finally, just to say a few things about the vocabulary gap. So what the research shows is that this gap actually reflects very broad, as I said, variation from those who know the least about words to those who know the most about words. And one of the questions that often comes up is, is it reasonable to think that we can close that gap? And I think what we know about variation and how enormous it is suggests that that's probably not a reasonable target, but rather what we need to do is focus our energies on trying to narrow that gap, supporting those at the upper end, but also trying to make sure that those at the bottom end have what they need to access the curriculum. One of the questions I've asked in my research is about whether this gap is widening and whether you're seeing these kind of Matthew effects with the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. Actually, in Key Stage 3, what I found was that wasn't the case. So that's really good news. However, I also didn't find that gap was narrowing substantially. So it is evidence that we perhaps could be doing more to try and pick up those kids who don't know as much as we would like about tier 1, tier 2 and tier 3 words. What we tend to measure in the kind of research I do is this tier 1 and tier 2 vocabulary. So I think there's a kind of open question about what's happening with tier 3 vocabulary. And that's something that I'm currently looking at the moment and tracking that over transition to see how that changes. And that's really interesting because that's the thing that we know teachers are really focusing on at the moment. So it'll be really interesting to see how that instruction is playing out. And maybe we might see some narrowing of the gaps in that case where there is lots of instruction. Alternatively, we might see that there is some widening because those who already know lots about words are kind of able to benefit from that instruction more than others. So I think there's some really interesting questions there that we will be answering with our current research with Dr. Laura Shapiro. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessie. That was a really, really helpful insight into your research and how it links to the report. Before I introduce Claire, just a quick reminder to all of our listeners, please do submit questions or comments to the panel using the chat function. But over now to Claire Jones, Deputy Head Teacher at Marine Academy.
Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me today. I have to say I'm delighted to be here. I'm even more delighted to have had the opportunity to read the report in advance, so thank you for that. The findings of the report have really resonated with me, myself as a teacher, in an area of social deprivation. The school that I work in is absolutely typical of the reason why we need this report. So I'm really glad that it's come about today. So many children enter reception below the national average in communication and language, and in my school fail the speech and language screening check that we conduct on entry. This is fairly typical and no surprise to many people in areas of social disadvantage. So as a school, it's paramount that we address the key findings identified in the report. So we have a duty to do everything we can in order to aid social mobility of these children. The quality of language that children are exposed to will prepare them for the transition for the next phase. We know that. But that cannot just begin in year 6. That absolutely needs to happen from the very beginning of their school year. We've spoken already about early years. We know the importance of it, and we know that there's a huge focus on that, but it just cannot be there. This can't be something, and at year 6, we suddenly think we're transitioning now, we need to do something. It's too late. School leaders have to consider how they can ensure that the teaching of vocabulary becomes an integral aspect of lessons, and they're not merely a set of laminated words on a wall that children can refer to if they wish, or a bolt-on exercise. So I'm going to talk about it in the context of our school. We've developed a curriculum so that it is ambitious enough not only for children to encounter an increased volume of academic vocabulary early, but also that they have the time to explore that vocabulary and revisit it later on. The specific teaching of vocabulary for us is paramount, and I think the report has shown that. The explicit teaching of vocabulary is also not limited to English lessons, and that is really integral. It has to have a high profile in all subjects, and you can do this, and we certainly do this, through the introduction of knowledge organisers, vocabulary maps, word lists, and specifically the pre-teaching of academic words and phrases. And that's really important for our children with an SEN need. Guided reading texts are carefully chosen to introduce different styles of language so that children to begin to learn the appropriate use of language depending on context. And it was really nice to see in the report that one of the recommendations was about code switching. So as a school, we've got many strategies in place for developing a love of reading so that when children want to read, we know it exposes them to a higher level of vocabulary. So in our school, we've introduced systems or practices, I should say, like DEAR, drop everything and read. So it becomes about children having exposure to a higher level of vocabulary and that it's modelled beautifully by teachers. We have initiatives in place like Pause to Read so that children who aren't exposed to that level of vocabulary, who aren't confident readers, they actually sit and read to our beautiful Academy dog Watson. It gives them the confidence to feel that they are readers. Now, one of the most important things for us is that teachers are modelling the correct use of language and are modelling a really good level of Tier 2 vocabulary in their day-to-day conversations with children, as well as in lessons. And that would be a real expectation on teachers to really consider their own use of language and really reflect on that. For parents, having that relationship with parents so that we can support them to have really good quality conversations at home with their children. It's important for us that we are taking this into account. So I was really pleased to see that in the findings of the report. So sending knowledge organisers home before a topic so that vocabulary can be really explored. And actually in our area, this is a high area of deprivation. Some of the parents themselves don't have the vocabulary, they don't have the language. And we know that a great deal of a child's vocabulary is found in their parents' vocabulary too. So it's really important that schools support parents in that. And finally, recognising the value of research, helping teachers to understand the significance of vocabulary and its link between academic achievement, not just social communication. So in our school, we've actually set up research groups where teachers are working together, they're studying, they're thinking about research from Alex Quigley and the Oxford University Press, so they can bring that to life in the classroom for our children.
Thanks very much indeed, Claire. Really useful thoughts to see how the findings of the report resonate with your experiences in school. Over now to Geoff Barton, who will be speaking to us, I suppose, both in his capacity as General Secretary of ASCL, but Geoff, also this is something you've been championing for years, so great to have you contributing today and really look forward to hearing your thoughts on this.
Thank you. Yeah, I was a fledgling English teacher once with hair many years ago. ASCL is the Association of School and College Leaders with the best motto in the universe. We speak on behalf of members, we act on behalf of children and young people, and they need us to act on their behalf. And that's why this report, I think, opens up some really important issues. Some of them familiar, some of them with a new nuance. And I just want to talk briefly about three things. I want to say something about COVID and why this might be a moment to do something differently or to do more of something we didn't do enough of before. I'll come back to that. Secondly, to just talk about vocabulary in slightly different terms. And thirdly, just to suggest some next steps which arise from the first 2 points. So let's just talk about COVID moment, first of all, because it seems to me what this has done is to hold up both a mirror to our education system, but it's also if you forgive the metaphor here, given us a telescope to look to what it could be like, right? We've seen how exam obsessed we are. We've also been reminded how there are every year a third of young people after all of those early years, primary, secondary teachers who leave without the dignity of a qualification. We have to do better than them. And just echoing what Jessie and Claire have said, you know, Claire makes the point that it's not enough just for teachers to pay lip service to it. Well, as a head of English for 7 years, I was always quoting George Sampson, the first ever English inspector, who was saying every teacher in English is a teacher of English. Is this the moment we can strip things back? Has COVID made us see what we need to do more of? And there was a sense, I think, at the beginning of the crisis that people were saying, oh, we're going to have lots of counsellors in school and we're going to have to suspend the curriculum. And in a sense, what we've seen is that young people have craved a sense of normality when they've got back into school. And what we ought to be doing is stripping back to what are the things that will make the biggest difference for them. Vocabulary is going to be part of that, as I'll explain in just a second. So can we use this moment to build a sense of what we're doing within our schools, but also, you know, Jessie mentions the Matthew effect. We've also seen that the gap between the advantage and the disadvantage has grown in a number of ways, hasn't it? And what the report acknowledges is if you're a child who's been at home, irrespective of the digital divide, if you've been at home with books and conversation, you will have had a significant advantage. So are there things that we might be able to do in the future which help to empower parents to know a bit better than they did at the beginning of this crisis, how they might help their child to develop their social skills as well as their language skills. So I use that as a springboard to say all of those things which we have known for many years, maybe they come into sharper focus. And maybe those, forgive me, reluctant teachers of some subjects who never thought it was their responsibility to be teaching vocabulary, maybe this is the moment when we go back to the basics of why we do things and why it will make you a better teacher of design technology or of maths or whatever it might be, as well as helping the child to learn. So my second point is quickly about vocabulary. You're the experts on this more than I am, and all I would say is that vocabulary is a very, very significant proxy for educational achievement. So that the child who writes in their English essay, in the book the writer says, will be deemed to be less intelligent than the one who says, in the novel, the author suggests. There's your level 2 vocabulary of suggests there. Every teacher's got a responsibility for that analytical language. And it seems to me that that does two things for the child. First of all, it helps them to express themselves more precisely. It gives them the sense that I'm starting to read, write, speak like a scientist, like a musician, like a historian. That's really important for educational achievement and a sense of self-worth. But it does something more important, because if you start to use words like demonstrates, suggests, analyzes, you suddenly belong to a different club. You start to move into the world of powerful people using powerful words, and we owe it to be able to do that and to do genuine leveling up for those young people with that kind of vocabulary. Maybe there's a case we can make more strongly around that. And that's why I would come to the teacher when we talk about vocabulary, why we just need to reinforce a sense that if you are a teacher of maths or of design technology, you will end up teaching better if those young people are starting to speak like mathematicians, starting to write like mathematicians, and so on and so forth. Is this the moment when we can improve our CPD, for example, with them? Which brings me to the final point, which is next steps. And I'll make 3 suggestions here. One is CPD. It is professional development in the way that we've heard from Claire of saying, if you just pay lip service to this, you are leaving some children at the mercy of their backgrounds and not taking seriously the responsibility that we all have, irrespective of a child's background, to bring them into the world of those of us who can use the language of power. That ought to be a sense of national mission made stronger by what we've seen through COVID, would be part 1, CPD. Secondly, hasn't this exposed for us that transition should be something not done to primary schools or done between schools, but something which we could rebuild to give a real sense of what is the information we want to pass on? Is this the moment we can get rid of a squalid reliance on Key Stage 2 tests and actually say, what is it we would want to share between us about what the child can do, can't do, how they learn and what they need to do next? And my final point would just be, is there an opportunity here with parents as well? Those parents who kind of give up on their child having the habits of reading because they don't know quite how to do it? Are there ways we could just strengthen those links between schools and families so that they're feeling that they're part of that mission as well for their child to be able to narrow the word gap? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Geoff. Over now to Helen Prince, who is an English advisor of ChatterStars. Over to you, Helen.
Thanks, Will. Do you know, it's just a joy to be in the company of so many passionate, like-minded vocabulary advocates this morning. It's just brilliant to listen to everybody, and I'm nodding away going, yes, yes, all of this. Huge thanks for inviting me along to this morning. It's an honour to be part of the panel. And I'm so excited about this new word gap report because it gives power to our elbow, doesn't it? We know from 2018 report what a hugely important area we're dealing with, and now we've got a bit more specificity, it's not always easy to say, about really looking at that transition. And what a fabulous focus for us, because in terms of impact, I think our impact of looking at what it is to move from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3 is huge. Such a focus on that that maybe is missed across some areas, but if we're looking at vocabulary, what it is to transition there, I think that could give us a real impact, greater coherence in our approach. So what I wanted to look at, and Will wave at me if I'm going on a bit too long, because I haven't started my timer and I'm already probably over, is to focus on the value of teacher modelling. So the report makes 8 key recommendations, and I was just delighted to read that one of those is about teacher modelling and the importance and value of the teacher in the classroom and their ability to model. At the risk of sounding a bit too Dead Poets Society, we as teachers hold these life chances in our hands, to echo what Geoff was just saying. Voice 21 tell us oracy is a moral cause, and vocabulary is at the heart, isn't it, of that moral cause. And unless we are really focusing on quality first teaching of what that teacher is able to facilitate in the classroom, then we're missing a huge opportunity to improve those life chances. Robin Alexander tells us this, doesn't he? Great that you're working with him, Emma. That's really exciting. But he tells us the teacher is uniquely powerful. Their ability as speaker and listener has huge ramifications in the not similar to how it does with reading. If you're not such a great reader, you don't like reading out loud, that doesn't impact your ability to teach reading. Not so with vocabulary and oracy. So the teacher and their ability to model is really key, and I think that we need to really focus on quality first teacher modelling of improving vocabulary as that teaching's happening. And one of my key mantras is that actually this is probably the most fun we can have in the classroom. And I think that because the ramifications of a poor vocabulary are so dire and so serious, we can sometimes forget that actually this is one of the most fun things you can do in a school, because what we're looking at is nuance, and we're looking at what does it mean to look at the key context and connotations of a word, and unpicking that and unpacking it in a classroom with students. You learn so much about them. You learn so much about what makes those pupils tick. What is it that they fear or love or are passionate about? And you can pull all of that out in a lesson on vocabulary. So if you're looking at nuance or upgrading word choice, looking at those tier 2 words, I just think that's one of the most fun things you can do in a classroom. So to facilitate that for our colleagues who are unbelievably stressed and busy right now, but to give them that opportunity of this is what good looks like, and this is a great fun activity to do, to look at vocabulary, I think would be, I'm just so delighted that teacher modelling is part of this report. It also enables us to look at oral rehearsal, and that's something I think, Jessie, you were referring to earlier, is that idea of having a writerly feel to your talk. So you are rehearsing sentences, you are actually thinking, what does it sound like to have a great sentence, to make this as impactful as it can be in its meaning and in its nuance, and to unpack that together in a safe environment, because talk
is a safe space, isn't it? Writing's courageous. What a courageous activity to put a pen on a paper and make it permanent. Talk is transitory, and so we've got that safer space in talk, that we can get it wrong, that we can model and look at what good looks like. How can we improve that particular part? How can we really move up to tier 2, to this language of power from you know, the initial ideas and excitement of whatever it is that you're looking at. So I just think that in particular, and certainly in the report, Dr. Jessie Ricketts, hi Dr. Jessie, talks about this importance of seeing the word. So you've actually got it captured. Here it is. This is one of the keywords we're talking about. You capture it, you put it up on display, you keep it, you refer to it again in the coming lessons, but it's something that you have captured. It's something precious. It's something captured, and I love that idea that we're seeing it, because it helps our young people to see how it sounds and how it looks like.
Say, Helen, that's 5 minutes.
Is that my 5 minutes? Okay. There's so much to say on this, and OUP are very kindly putting on another webinar exactly on this on the 17th of November. So do come and join me for that if you can. That's at 4 o'clock on the 17th.
Sure.
Thanks, Will.
No problem, and thank you to all our panelists for those thoughts and those insights. So we've got questions coming through, and I think there's one here that I want to pick out and pose first to Claire, and then Emma. Actually, I'm going to come to you before you need to leave us at 10, because I think it has particular resonance with the early years and with primary, although of course not exclusively. But how can we target development of emotional intelligence and social communication through language acquisition? Claire, what do you see as our options there, and what's the significance of that for the transition?
Okay, so it's really important that we use vocabulary in that context, and certainly in school in the early years, through the development of stories and using the sort of vocabulary that we want children to have at that higher level, that academic level, is really, really important. And certainly that continues through the school at that transition point. I think it's really important to expose children to that language, because one of the panelists made a really good point earlier, that it's not through osmosis. Children it just doesn't arrive. And so again, it's bringing it back to modeling and just really providing lots and lots of different opportunities for children to have that exposure.
Thank you, Claire. Emma, is there anything that you would like to add in terms of your experience working in early years infant settings?
Yeah, I agree with Claire in that it has to be modelled and explicitly taught. Now, there was a song I used to like playing to children when I used to talk about using other words instead, which is one of those earworm songs. So I do warn you, if you listen to it, you will be singing it for the rest of the day, which is the song called The Humongous Song. And it was a song about the word big being very boring, and there's other words you can use instead of the word big. And the word that this little cartoon likes is the word humongous. And I used to play that to young children, and we used to sing along to it, and they absolutely loved the humongous song. And part of the reason was to say, look, there were lots of other words that are really much more exciting than some of these words. And so we used to make it into a little bit of a game. So when someone would say the word like big, we'd all go, oh, boring. Let's find an exciting word. Let's not use these boring words. And it became quite a game that we'd model, and we'd do the partner talk, and we'd talk about using these new exciting grown-up words, because they were only sort of between 5 and 7, and they loved feeling very grown up and using grown-up words. But it comes back to this, having something that is explicitly taught and modelled and then used in shared writing, and where do we put these words? And whenever you taught them a new word, they put it everywhere in everything, with no real understanding of exactly where this word should go or where it should mean. But the teacher said it was really good, so we're going to use it now all of the time. But it just comes back to that, having that time and space to really explain and to show how they can be used explicitly, and not to just expect children to develop these skills through osmosis. But that, I think, goes back to having the time, having the space in the curriculum, allowing teachers to do what they need to do, and not having that sort of pressure to think, oh, you know, we're running out of time, we've got to move on to something else because we've got so much content to cover. Actually have the space and time to develop this. If we see it as a priority, we have to really make time for it. And that's the sort of one of the things we're getting from the OSCE PPG. And just to reiterate the point I already made, my concern is all of this time where you'd spend having those conversations, modeling this language in shared writing, because of COVID, might be restricted because of the physical way classrooms are having to be laid out with COVID does restrict that time to have those circle time discussions, those partner discussions. Let's talk with your partner about how you can use this word in a sentence. You know, that's very difficult to do in this time, and there is a real worry that we could be moving backwards in terms of explicit sort of language development because of the constraints we're facing.
Thanks, Emma. And I think some important ties there with the findings that are coming out of the OSCE PPG as well, in terms of cultivating an environment, particularly at the start of secondary, where new students feel able to communicate openly and honestly about you know, how they're feeling. We've had a couple of questions here about the significance of English as an additional language. And I think firstly, just to set some parameters on this, this is not the report's focus, and there's an important reason for that, which is that we absolutely recognise that the responses to and resulting strategies for students speaking English as an additional language are likely to be distinct from some of the strategies set out in this report, which is more general. So I think that's an important caveat to recognise the importance of seeing that as a slightly separate discussion. But that said, Jessie, I know you have some thoughts on this. So can I invite you just to say something about what you see as the significance of EAL at the transition, and if you can, any strategies that schools might be able to adopt to support those learners?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really important question too. I think you need to start by recognising, though, that the kind of term EAL and the term bilingual, they cover a very large group of children in this country, so it clearly is a really important issue. But also there's a lot of variability and a lot of different children that make up that group. So different things will work for different children. That said, if you are talking about a situation where a child, which I think often is our primary concern, where you've got a child who speaks one language or maybe more than one language at home, and then they come to school, and not only do they need to get used to that environment like every other child, but they also need to get used to kind of academic or English anyway at school. And in that kind of situation, I think the important thing to recognise is, and these kind of tiers of vocabulary are really helpful here, because probably what's happened is that they've got lots of background in kind of tier 1 vocabulary in their primary language or languages. And then they go to school and they're probably encountering some of that language, but also some other language in school. And I guess that kind of difference in the language context that the different contexts in which they're learning those languages gives us really important insights in terms of what we should target at school. So it might actually be that we need to really target that tier 1 vocabulary in English to make sure that that's all in place before we start moving on to more complex language, because primarily they might know that in their primary language or languages. So I guess that's one point that I think is really important to make. And then, of course, I think the things that we do to promote language, by and large, will be quite similar to what we would do with other people. As Helen said, I'm a strong advocate of emphasising the visual form of a word, even in children who can't read very much. That seems to just give them a really useful hook on which to kind of hang everything else. And then doing all of the things that we do, you know, clapping to emphasize the sounds of words, allowing children to play with words, allowing them to put them in different contexts, making sure they can talk in the classroom even under these strange circumstances. Yeah, thank you, Will.
Thanks, Jessie, really helpful. And I think what I will add is that the report is unabashed in making the case that a really wide variety of forms of language and vocabulary deserve celebration. And I think engages with those ideas head on. we've got a fascinating question here, which I'm going to read in full just because I think the context is helpful. It's from a teacher. We are piloting a vocabulary programme across 40 or so schools this term. What has been striking is the variation from one school to the next as to the target vocabulary they've selected. Do you believe that there can be a robust centralised vocabulary list that any school should pick up, such as an academic word list? Or would you say that each school needs to develop its own vocabulary list, taking into account the local context and teachers' understanding of their pupils and their families? So I'm thinking, Claire, it would be good to come to you first on this, and then Helen, if I can come to you after that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, and it's something that we discuss a lot in school, because actually thinking about tier 2 words, what is a tier 2 word for one child may actually not be one for another, in that it's not in their usual vocabulary. And we thought very deeply about whether we should have this list that we work through, and we decided against that, because I think actually you're really right. Context is important, and what we tend to do is children will find words that they don't understand. We cannot possibly understand or know, every word that children do or don't know. So sometimes they have to come up in context. So I think words like analyse, compare, all of those sorts of academic vocabulary, we do need to make sure that children understand and know so that they can go on and be successful at the point of transition. But in general, on a day-to-day basis, when we're modelling excellent language, what we tend to do is use words that we have something whereby in a drop everything and read slot, a word may come up. So for example, children will read it being read to and the word chortle came up. When we actually explored that, lots of children in the class didn't understand that word, and that led to some fantastic discussions about what it might mean. And it really highlighted the point that actually when children are missing one or two words in a passage, the whole passage does not make sense to them, or, so that is really important. So in answer to the question, I think that no, schools there shouldn't be a centralised list that schools work through. There should be some words that they absolutely do work through, but others need to be in context. I think it's really important, a really important question.
Thank you. Helen, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would echo that very much. I think we certainly in secondary, we are facilitating exam-ready students and working back from those endpoints of GCSEs. We need to make sure that we have equipped our young people with the vocabulary that's going to enable success. So there does need to be some kind of centralised version of what that looks like in each subject area. But equally, context is everything, isn't it? And so within your setting, your own context is really vital. So making sure that you are appealing to each and every one of your community. In the report, I picked it out actually because I just thought it was the most beautiful thing that I'd read in a long time. It's a quote by Zara B. I hope I've said her name right. And she says that for children to access language, sometimes they have to see themselves in it and see themselves in those who speak the language. Words devoid of context are very difficult to claim. So I think there is a real benefit to having a contextualized vocabulary within your own subject area, but of course within your own community and where your setting lies. But equally, we need to make sure that our young people are ready for their next steps, and their next steps once they're in secondary school are going to look like year 11 exams. So we need to make sure that there is some kind of central bank that's feeding into the platform they need to be ready for.
Thanks, Helen.
Can I say one little thing about the EAL point just that came up a second ago, which was that we do have our ready-made experts, don't forget, in MFL. So our modern foreign language teachers are absolute experts of teaching vocabulary, because that's what they do. And there's a ready-made resource there that maybe we don't share widely enough. I just wanted to make that point. Sorry, I know it wasn't.
No, that's helpful. And also, I see in the comments that people are flagging the research of the Nuffield Early Language Intervention as well, which has a lot to say on this as well. Loic, I'll come to you. I know you want to add to this.
Yeah, I was wanting to come back on my point about word lists, and one of the things we flag in the report is the value of corpus-based resources, so resources that are based on analysis of what language is used. And I think those do have a really valuable role to play, because as Claire says, once you start encountering text where unfamiliar words kind of breach a certain threshold, it becomes very difficult to access those texts. And if we want to unlock those texts for pupils, then they need to know the vocabulary that's used in those texts. So I think there is great value to lists in that sense, but we need to avoid that rigidity. So it might be a list, but then pupils may want to start at different points in it. And, you know, we talk always about zones of proximal development, don't we, in education, and that question of, okay, where is that child at, and what are the words that are going to allow that child to then move beyond what's familiar. So that's why we need to be, you know, treasuring what is familiar to pupils, and then taking them beyond that to unlock the next set of texts.
Thanks, Loic. And I would direct readers to the case study of Greenshaw High School in the report as well, with its big words work, which addresses exactly this point head on. So we've got some questions here, which I think are around the practicalities of all of this. So it's all well and good us saying that vocabulary is important, and we know that there's lots of agreement on that, but how we actually turn that into action. Geoff, I'm going to come to you first on this. How can school leaders and teachers put into practice on Monday morning some of what we're saying here around the other time constraints they're facing with obviously the curriculum, with the various tests at the end of key stages, and also, of course, dealing with COVID?
Well, I think probably two or three things to that. I think what we've got now, which we didn't have a few years ago, is the opportunity for teachers to be interacting with other teachers online and learning from them. You know, when I started, the classroom was a place where you and 30 kids did whatever you were able to do, but actually CPD wasn't always as easy as it can be now. Secondly, we've referenced case studies. We've got them in the OUP report today. So actually looking at what other schools have been able to do, often in very disadvantaged areas because they think it's a priority. And thirdly, that would be my other point, that I think there is a complete misunderstanding that if you are going to, as a design technology teacher, spend some time teaching young people some of the vocabulary they will need, that is a distraction from teaching them technology. It seems to me it's the other way around. What you do is you make learning more efficient. That's why we use words like photosynthesis, so that we don't have to say this is the process of plants turning green, or I didn't do science, as you can tell. You kind of know what I mean. I think we just need to make that case. And I go back to saying COVID has given us an opportunity to say, what are the absolute priorities? And if you subscribe to this notion that this isn't just about helping children to learn, it's bringing them to the world that we want for our own children, then we have to make the time to do that. But we won't do it unless we go back to the why this is important, so that every teacher in English recognises that they have a role to play as a teacher of English, looking at case studies of how that can be done.
Thanks, Geoff. Loic, I'm going to spring this on you. Are there any particular recommendations in the report you want to flag in this respect, in terms of managing this around the time constraints imposed by all the other things that schools are dealing with?
I mean, I think part of it is about the recognition that vocabulary is almost a shortcut to a lot of other things, so it's almost an efficiency gain. So you're not taking time away from other things, you're dealing in advance with a lot of the problems that might otherwise require all sorts of interventions and other activities. So I think I'd probably be flagging the efficiency gains.
Sure. Okay, thank you. There's a question here which I think, given we've got 5 minutes remaining, we'll see how we get on. It may be our last question. And Helen, I'm going to come to you first on it. Is there a risk to the casual listener that the discussion of the word gap leads to focusing on vocabulary at the expense of language in its entirety? Helen, what are your thoughts on that?
It's a really interesting question. My view is that oracy is king in the classroom, and we need to enable our young people to be strong communicators so that they can express emotion. It's so tied in with well-being. It's an integral part of creating a fully rounded, happy human to enable them to have a powerful voice. And obviously at the heart of that sits the vocabulary and the choices of vocabulary and enabling their language of power, language of instruction, so that they can access those other worlds. But I think, do you know, I'm a drama teacher at heart. I love drama. I think drama is one of the most underrated subjects. If you ask employers, this came out a few years ago, didn't it? If you ask employers, what are the attributes you most want in your employees? All of those skills are taught in drama. And so for my opinion, I think that we need to look really closely at what we're doing in education about, I mean, obviously we've got COVID right now, but is there too much sitting in rows quietly listening? We know that Voice 21 tell us that in a deprived area, on average, children are speaking 4 words a lesson. 4 words a lesson. And that can't be conducive to building an empowered voice. So my view is that this is a bigger concept of how we teach, and that drama and the thought behind how we create strong, empowered communicators needs to be the lens through which we deliver everything. The curriculum should be delivered through that lens.
Well, could I just add a couple of quick comments on that, if you don't mind? Yeah. First of all, absolutely agree. We know from Debbie Myhill's brilliant research that good speaking and listening underpins all other learning. But notice, it's the good speaking and listening. When we talk about oracy, it isn't just that children are speaking in classrooms, it's the quality of what they're doing in classrooms. And what that will mean, just like we would do with writing and indeed reading, is we would need to model that, teach them what that looks like. And that's why I think in this report, the code switching bit is so important, because there is an assumption sometimes from young people that using lots of big words is the way you are successful. Actually, it isn't about that. It's about making a decision about which is an appropriate word. And you can do that in having a debate about fox hunting or in doing a piece of writing. It's the quality of that underpinned by speaking and listening, which then feeds into both vocabulary, which is important, and teaching syntax. And I'll just make one quick point of that, because the young people who will do least well will join their sentences together as compound sentences. That is, they will write with and or, and their sentences will be longer. And we know again from Debbie Myhill's research that the young people who tend to do best ultimately in their writing, whether it's in exams or in the real world, tend to use shorter and longer sentences. They have variety of sentence. Again, we just need to teach syntax alongside teaching vocabulary.
Thanks, Geoff. That's a really nice segue into the final question, which rather shamelessly I'm going to pose to Loic. I'm calling CfEY privilege here. But we've had some, I think, really constructive questions about the importance of code switching, which is something that the report discusses in some detail. Loic, can I come to you for just your closing thoughts on code switching, its importance, how schools can support it, and then I know you've got a final thought that you'd like to add as well.
Yeah, I think I mean, I'm glad Geoff just laid out his thoughts there, because I think it's really important. As I mentioned in the chat, Malcolm Richards, who's in the report, speaks about this quite a lot, and I think there's something to be said for being very open about how we talk about code switching and how we talk about how language is tied in with power and how we can empower young people to make those active decisions that Geoff describes between different types of language and what fits in different circumstances, and to see that as fun. There was a question earlier on about teaching Greek and Latin, and I remember quite a few years back doing a project where we were doing some research in prisons, looking at a program called Sound Training that was being taught in prisons. And these prisoners were learning to read, but through a really strong focus on vocabulary and looking at the Greek and Latin roots of words. And what I remember about that is the degree of fun that was involved. And I love this idea that Helen flagged up about just how fun words can be. Emma had the same theme. And I think one of the things I'd kind of like to close with is this idea of vocabulary being a fun thing. It's not an ordeal. You know, Helen told us about the ramifications of vocabulary, and like that's just such a nice word, isn't it? And to be and children love playing with words, and if we can see this as an opportunity to say to our pupils, let's take control of the language that we have at our disposal. Let's widen our repertoire. Let's play with that, and let's think about how we use different words in different circumstances. Then I think vocabulary can be a really empowering thing for everyone.
Thanks, Loic. That's a great point to end the panel discussion with. I think, you know, we could obviously continue talking about this all day. We're not going to do that. And I know that there are questions that people have asked that we haven't had time to reach. So apologies if you're one of the people who's asked those questions.
You ask away on Twitter, and I'm happy. I'm sure we're all happy to get back to you via Twitter.
Yeah. Please do follow up on Twitter. I think all that remains for me to say before I hand back to Jane is a massive thank you to our panelists and to our attendees today for listening in and sharing your thoughts and questions. And just personally as well to thank the contributions of the experts and the schools in the report. You know, someone who was fortunate, and this is obviously pre-COVID, but fortunate enough to be visiting some of the schools for this research. You know, it was just a joy seeing what they were doing, and we were so grateful for their input. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the people listening in today. Thank you to the schools contributing to the report. And Jane, over to you for your closing comments.
Thanks, Will. Well, I'd really like to add my thanks to those of Will, to the panel, and to everyone who participated today. It's been a really fascinating discussion, and I think it really highlights just how much we all care deeply about addressing the issues raised. And I think I'm so glad that the report has been so well received. You can find it on the OUP website. It's been a major piece of ongoing research for OUP. And we will continue to be looking at how we can address and narrow the word gap as we move forward. I think there are a number of really clear avenues ahead. What we will do is continue to work with our wide and growing network of word gap partner schools. We have over 1,000 who share best practice. And we'd really love to hear from anyone who's doing interesting things in this area, because I think if we can help disseminate that good practice to a wider audience, that will be hopefully a real benefit. We do offer free resources that give practical support around subjects, including a Key Stage 2-3 pack on transition, which is available. We also want to carry on drawing on the best vocabulary research that's out there in order to underpin the publishing that we produce to ensure that it does support all children. We also want, and I think this has been a really important area that perhaps we should come back to, is to support parents in the important role they play at home and explore how sort of stronger home-school links can be fostered around vocabulary. And obviously they've played an incredibly important role over COVID. And we want to we really think it's important to continue to work with policymakers and experts in the field to look at how space, and I think Emma's really highlighted that, the importance of making space to embed vocabulary teaching across all subjects and ensure there's a seamless curriculum development from primary into secondary, and look at areas of training. We'd really like to thank the Centre for Education and Youth, Loic and his brilliant team for working with us on this report. It's been a great experience working with you. With the ongoing pandemic and so much pressure on young people, we really feel this is something we need to work together to get right. So thanks everybody, a really great discussion.